Dobro, brzo ćemo se sad prebaciti na engleski. Dobro večer. Prvo i ovako. Good evening everyone and welcome to the panel The View from the Outside, held as part of the Critics Colloquium of the same name, which brings together critics from various European countries. Our speakers this evening are Patrizia Lorenzoni. She's a scholar of the history of ideas, writer, cultural critic and translator, and she comes from Sweden. Then Moanis Sinanovic, a literary and film critic, writer, poet, and essayist. He's awarded for his books of poetry and prose and comes from Slovenia. And our third speaker today is Arjan Leka, author of numerous books of poetry, prose, essays, and literary studies, recipient of national and international awards. His works are included in major European anthologies and is translated into many languages. And he works as a researcher at the Institute for Linguistics and Literature and teaches at the University of Arts and comes from Albania. So thank you all three for joining us this evening here at Buxa. In line with the title, The View from the Outside, this colloquium is dedicated to a critical engagement with literature that is most often placed at the margins of the literary field, such as small literatures, translations, works written outside initial literary environments, works that circulate primarily in a transnational literary space, as well as a range of other peripheral and minority literary perspectives. This year's colloquium is dedicated to Dubravka Ugrešić, an author who, in various contexts, whether we speak of post-Yugoslav, European, or world literature, offers a kind of view from the edge, the familiarizing image of the world. So Ugrešić will also be a source of inspiration for our discussion today. This panel will consist of short presentations by the participants, after which we will continue with the discussion, and let us begin by hearing what our speakers have to say on this topic of the view from the outside. If we could go in this order, starting from Arjan Leka to yes, according to the topics you provided. But if you wish to have another arrangement, that is also okay. Okay, if it's okay for you, yes, to start, and then we can go in the different order. That was only a suggestion according to the topics. Okay, so we will hear what Patrizia Lorenzoni.
Can you hear me well? Good, great. I firstly just want to express my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me here. I'm excited about this opportunity to participate in this conversation. And I was trying to think about the title of the conversation, The View from Outside, and what can be both revealed and hidden in such a title. I guess we all, not only as cultural critics, but also as creative writers, somehow struggle with interpretation and translation, and of course also when we engage in the explicit practice of translation. And I take as a point of departure work that I have been, for a number of years, I have been working on a translation of a book that when I still taught with a little more frequency at the university, I used to present this book to my students as an untranslatable book. And now I'm translating it myself into Swedish. And parts of this book has been published, but the translation of the whole is not yet finished. I also suspect that it is my work with this particular text that is the main reason I was invited here. So the book is a classic within Chicano literature. Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera, a book from 1987 that is a dwindling essay and collection of poems taking shape around the borderlands between that, what we today in this political configuration call the US and Mexico. And I think perhaps I need to say just a few words about this geographical area, put it in a historical context. So Gloria Anzaldúa grew up in a poor Spanish-speaking farm worker family in Texas, which we know is today part of the US. However, her great-grandparents had lived in Texas, which was then part of Mexico. In 1848, after several wars, Mexico lost almost half of its territory to the US, and the Spanish-speaking population were suddenly perceived as foreigners in their own land. Most of them also lost their farms. But the Anglo invasion of Mexico was, of course, not the first one in these lands. Before that, it was the Spanish invaders, and even before that, the Azteca, who violently had forced the local communities into an economy of war and human sacrifices. So Anzaldúa writes from a borderland marked by contemporary racism and white chauvinism, but also marked by a long history of repeated wars of conquest. She writes in English, the language of the latest wave of conquerors. But her English is broken up with Spanish of different dialects, and sometimes with Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire. The most frequently quoted words from this book is found in the very beginning of it, where Anzaldúa writes, the US-Mexican border es una herida abierta where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Una herida abierta in Spanish is an open wound, but these words are written in the book in Spanish as if English cannot do justice to the pain. So the border is an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. I am here with you tonight, bringing with me Anzaldúa and her particular borderland, its urgency accentuated by recent US policy and the intensified practice of internments and deportations. But I'm also here with the inner and outer borderlands of Sweden, where just as in the US, we are at this very moment seeing an intensified politics of deportation, bringing the herida abierta, the open wound, into our societies and into my own family as well. For my son, whom I only a year ago believed to be safe in Sweden, is suddenly among the ones directly threatened by a politics of deportation. My son, as I call him, a son from another mother, is today a young man marked by the Swedish regime as unwanted. In the crucial year of 2015, he was a teenager coming through the Balkan route, crossing among various other countries, Croatia, on foot and by bus before arriving in Sweden. So this is where I find myself among you, as a writer, translator, and cultural critic with a professional interest in the topic of this meeting. Also, as someone deeply committed to the rights of those who cross borders or are crossed by them, but also as someone who in my personal life is touched by borders in ways that at the moment do not stop hurting. Now, the border in Anzaldúa's text is a dividing line, but it's more than a line. It's a territory of barbed wire, but also of resistance and possibility, a third country for whatever does not fit into a system of categories and classifications. And I will quote a short passage for you from her book, where she says, a borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residues of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. Los atravesados live here, the squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal. End of quote. So, as I said, Anzaldúa's text is a linguistically hybrid text. It was published in the US in 1987. It is mainly written in English, but have long enough passages in Spanish so as to close off significant parts of the text to the non-Spanish speaking reader. And in the beginning of my translating, I argued some with editors about the passages in Spanish, and I insisted that these passages should not be translated, even in footnotes. For what she does very consciously in the text is depriving the majority of the privilege to imagine the text to be transparent. And this, I argue that this must be respected in translation. I have also toyed with the thought of having the Spanish passages translated into a language with a similar status in Sweden as Spanish has in the US, and that would be either Finnish or meänkieli, or perhaps both. Now this is an important issue, but it's also a quite technical issue. But then, how do you translate the pain of the border? Ansaldoa's project, and this is important, is a theoretical one. It has, in a sense, a universal claim. She dives deep into the particularities of the US-Mexican borderlands, of its racism, its Anglo-chauvinism, its sexism, its patrolling vigilantes, its coyotes and wetbacks, its abandoned and mistreated goddesses. But she does so in order to speak with a voice with universal relevance. And my motivation for introducing her in Sweden and translating her is that, in my view, she succeeds. The text does something that exceeds far beyond the particular context in which it was written. But again, how do you translate the pain? In the description of this event, there is a reference to Azadeh Shayan's notion of a third geography as an alternative space of memory, language, and translation. And connecting to that, I wish to raise a cautioning, but also suggest something in relation to the outside of the title. The cautioning is because I think there is a risk when we theorize about these third spaces, about these geographies, and I am self-critical here as well. I think there is a risk of us reducing them to text, to literature, to symbolic questions of identification. And this risk is kind of built into it. Ansaldoa can well be, and has indeed been, read as an inspiring work on hybrid identities, and not much more. I have struggled with this with students, kind of come beyond these reductive readings. For if we manage to really listen to the text, to really read her, we will find it embedded deeply in the material realities of the earth, of Texas. And this is not in any way to say that the relevance of it is limited to the struggles there, but rather that we should ask ourselves, what can the calls from this wretched earth tell us about the materialities of struggles also far away from there? And I will here come to and kind of conclude with my suggestion that perhaps we need another way to speak of such spatial categories as inside and outside. And I bring in here the work of a critical migration scholar, Nicholas de Genova, who analyzes the place, not in literature, but very materially, the place of the migrant in European and US-American societies. And he does so in terms of an including exclusion. That is, what is perceived as an exclusion in reality is an inclusion, but an inclusion of someone precisely as excluded. And this is, in his work, is a question of resources and labor, and it's supposed to look at the dependence in both the US and in European societies on, for example, undocumented migrant work, to see that, yes, these people are very much on the inside of the system. Criminalization of migrant and migrant deportations are a spectacle that helps to produce a workforce totally deprived of rights and therefore unable to raise demands on justice. So de Genova talks about this as a scene of exclusion hiding an obscene of inclusion. And in this perspective, Ansaldoa, with her writing from the rural Texas, does not provide a view from the outside as a member of an excluded community, minority. Rather, what her borderland is, her claimed land of barbed wire, is precisely such an area of included exclusion. And such an area is also, it's an area where inside and outside coincide, like in a Möbius strip, if you know the mathematical construction. That is a Möbius strip. So I will end that with that suggestion.
fruitful remarks. Maybe we could have other presentations and then the discussion at the end. So, would you like to maybe continue, or Aryan, since you are choosing the order? Yeah,
I'm not choosing the order. I'm offered the scene.
Yeah, we changed the concept, so now
All the people first.
we have another principle now. Okay.
Is it good to have it here? Do you hear
Yes,
this?
of course.
It's okay. So I have prepared something particular on my way, because when I received the invitation to join this panel, I thought it could be most useful for all of us to speak not only theory, but also about something real that helps restore the broken relationship in literature. I will briefly spot how this affects Albanian literature, so I will talk for this home speciality, especially for the Albanian literature, which is thinking that our problems are your problems too. My short introduction exposed some personal doubts regarding to how can we advance our tools for reading literature from both sides, inner and outside perspective. How can we avoid ethnocentric judgments about the literature, and which instruments help literature to transcend borders most? In her book, Literature as a World, Pascal Casanova observed that global writing functions as a hierarchy, describing that it is a pyramidal structure and pyramidal system too. Important centers, which have big languages and wide market in the background, hold not only the symbolic power versus so-called minor literary provinces. Are they who set standards for what some literatures are considered big and universals, because it is not only one, and why some others are small provinces of the literature? Formally, the capitals and provinces are organized the same, but they do not operate in the same time. The centers make verdicts to the smaller one, but the smaller does not. This is an unfair cultural inferiority among us. Usually, writing in the small language like Albanian is reduced for a big culture to something exotic and charming. It could be attractive, but not essential enough. Yes, it is a fact that a small language is presented on the shelves of the world literature, but more for geopolitical reasons than aesthetical one. Among them, Albanian literature is seen as such, but it is not an isolated case among the other so-called small languages. But let us refine the concept of a small literature. In my opinion, a small literature does not mean a literature without importance or less respected one. A small literature, in my opinion, refers to a limited audience, which without support of the domestic and international critics, will stay within modest limitation. But writers like Gospodinov today, Kurlejak, Kish, Selimovic, Kavafis, Kazantzakis, as well Kadar and Derlich, prove that high-quality literature does not come only from the imperial languages, but also from small provincial languages too, so-called. So another question is, are critics, as negotiators, capable to overcome the favoritism between languages? Are they able to decode from outside our transnational diasporic migration writing in the context of global literature? Or it is all a homework for the domestic critics to do first? On the other hand, from the moment we use a term like small literature or small language, we accept something fundamental. In a globalized world, everything which is considered small no longer runs freely. It depends on many factors like institutions, translators, translations, publishers, media, and literary critics. So we understand that the literature from the small languages is not independent anymore. Another question connecting to that is who gives a voice to a small literature when the centers always include them in the waiting list? Who opens the door for them if critics remain all silence or discount voices from the margins? With this outlook in my mind, I want to bring up any case involving Albanian literature, but shortly. Since centuries, Albanian literature has tried to reach the centers of the world of writing. An important illustration is the Albanian humanist Marin Barleti. His history of Skanderbeg was translated into main European languages like French, Italian, English, and German 5 centuries ago. So the street from the periphery to the center was long existed. In the 19th century was another case when the Romantic French poet Alphonse de Lamartine read the work of Geronimus de Rada, an Albanian poet in the diaspora, and wrote to him, "Poetry came from your shores and it must return there." This was the attempt to reveal the broken relationship between the center and the peripheries of European literature. Again, these examples show that the centers and peripheries are not fixed. Recent Nobel Prize shifted the center to Poland and to the Polish, to Norway and to the Norwegian language, to Hungary and to Hungarian language. In this shifting landscape, Albanian literature has begun to enlarge the territory, but not without many difficulties. Years ago, together with my colleague Ardian Kyçüku, who is a writer, a very good writer and professor who writes from Bucharest, a kind of diaspora, we studied the translation of Albanian literature in EU and Western Balkan languages and the role of the critics from outside in this process. The conclusions were sharp. Despite a relative progress, Albanian literature is still seen as minor, unknown, or misread literature. Who does Albanian literature stay misread today when it is more globally visible than before? Who is still tricky to introduce it? For years, except for Ismail Kadare, Albanian literature stayed hidden. In her article, Not Small, Minor, Jana Bukova highlights that Kadare global success must have opened door for others, but one writer was not enough in our case. A literary presence needs a system, not just an author. After 90s, Albanian literature emerged from isolation, but with the same authors. The same authors dominate the stage. The same monopoly of names grew up. Critics did not propose a polyphonic scene of the landscape or the map, literary map. Younger authors found little space in the promotion, and at the same time, translations were by chance and standards unclear. As a result, our literature has been, as still is, more dependent on luck than structure. Albanian literature is no less visible because it lacks artistic value, but because the supporting system is still incomplete. The voices from the strong literature critics would have been significant, but they are not at all. I'm talking now for the translators and translating. We all know the metaphor of translation as a bridge. It sounds poetic, but it is used much more in the political language. We can use the same metaphor for the critics too, but the duty of a bridge is not only to connect the shores, but to let the river pass through. From some years, we have in Albania our National Book Center, and thanks to it, several books are translated and be published in several languages. But having a center and the fund is not enough to have translators and publishers. By the other side, translators have helped Albanian literature to meet the other, and meeting the other is both an artistic and ethical imperative, as Dubravka Ogresic wrote. But some of the best translators from Albanian into other languages, they live abroad. In the same situation are the critics. They live abroad too. The distance stops them to follow the daily life process of the literature. It is still lack of long-term programs to bring translators closer to the reality of the countries. So, how to realize the progress when the foreign language faculty so-called produce, mostly translators for business, tourism, and public service sector, but not for literary translation and translators. Albanian literature is often remained marginal, even when some authors realize success abroad, mainly because, like translators and critics, the author live abroad, mainly because their books were written in foreign languages, and after many years, after the success, they have been translated into Albanian language, connected to them maybe because the topic were filtered through the taste of foreigner readers, and the last promotes a new issue to discuss. Sometimes, but still often, Albanian literature is formed by a foreign market mentality. Books are composed as cliches produced to meet foreign expectations. Writing according to the market transforms the literature, especially our literature, but not only Albanian literature, I'm talking now for regional literature, transforms the literature into a modified artifact. The phenomenon, for us, it is not quite new, and it is a pity to replace it. During the dictatorship, Albanian literature and Albanian authors rise on order of the state, and now the risk is, but the real risk is that they are writing on order of the market. Even foreign publishers mostly follow the trends. They are ordering some very specific themes and topics for our writers. They select, I'm talking about publisher, few authors who write in profound artistic language or universal manner. Topics like the canon, the blood vendettas, the dictatorship trauma, Besa, bunkers, immigration, trafficking, the sexuality of sworn virgins, the Kosovo War, the Albanian exorcism are real. And it is nothing wrong to write about them. But still, when they become a precondition for translation into other languages, Western Balkans or EU language, they reduce the literature into a garage of stereotypes. On the other hand, the new phenomenon is emerged. Some authors, not yet confirmed, in an inner space, in an inner scene, use the translation abroad as self-promotion in Albania to impose themselves on the domestic scene from abroad. For this reason, a view from outside often promises more fame than quality. But still, perhaps, we have some reason to be hopeful. A writer, maybe you know the case of Jehona Kica, who was shortlisted for the German Book Prize this year with her novel, only one vocal is the title, And also another writer, like Ledia Joga, was longlisted for the Booker Prize of this year with her novel Misinterpretation is a Hope. The case shows that transnational writers and writers from outside of the nation have some other opportunity. They have been native-born Albanian, but they write in other languages, not in Albanian languages. But can we count them as a personal success of the author or as a success of Albanian literature too? I'm asking because they acted out of the scene and far from the inner system. Anyway, their success helped to rebuild the lost relationship between Albanian literature and the critics. But as Borges wrote in the myth of Theseus, the first step is to search the lost year, and after, passionately to reconnect two universes, as Pascal Casanova wrote. Thank you.
And to continue with the Slovenian perspective from Slovenian literature.
Thank you. I have written this in Slovenian language and translated it with ChatGPT, so I will not pretend for that. I will just read it, so it will have more flow. Relations between the center and the periphery in the global capitalist system have changed significantly over the past decades. This transformation was driven by the financialization of capitalism during the shift from a Fordist regime of accumulation to a post-Fordist one. Financialization went hand in hand with globalization, understood as the export of Western industry to the world's periphery in the global south, which in some cases through industrialization managed to rise into the semi-periphery. Leading this process were capitalists from the United States, the dominant capitalist country in the post-Second World War era. The establishment of a powerful financial industry combined with the export of productive industry necessitated by the costs of the Vietnam War and the inclusion of black Americans within the framework of civil rights allowed the US dollar to remain the world's reserve currency. The global bourgeoisie invested its financial surpluses in Wall Street, and immense amounts of money flowing in, together with the development of computer technology and new calculative capacities it enabled, fueled an expansion of securities trading that could no longer be covered by the real economy. An additional factor in this expansion was the infamous abolition of the gold standard in determining the value of the dollar. Globalization and the sense of economy's fictiousness also caused the disintegration of formerly self-evident cultural values, giving rise to postmodernist literature and its great novels. If Europe was the homeland of the great modernist novels, the United States became, for the aforementioned reasons, the homeland of the great postmodernist ones. Simultaneous with the process of financialization came the collapse of the Soviet bloc and of Yugoslavia, the leading country of the non-aligned movement, which included many states of today's periphery and semi-periphery. This gave new momentum to neo-colonial relations. Globalization allowed countries such as India and especially China to make partial and sometimes astonishing leaps out of mass poverty, while pushing others into even deeper misery and instability. The devastation wrought by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund through global indebtedness, as well as numerous military interventions by NATO countries, created failed states unable to care for their citizens, who are left to eke out an existence of fall into conflict among local militias fighting for resources and war spoils, often in the name of religious or ethnic ideologies. This has triggered large-scale immigrations to the West as the other side of globalization. At the same time, in the era of rapidly moving financial capital, large supranational economic clusters and institutions began to form. Many inhabitants of European Union countries today feel they are losing their national identity and becoming increasingly dependent on centers of power in Brussels and Washington. Immigrants, who are important not only as an active labor, but also as a reserve army of labor left to lumpenproletarian activities, are becoming a problem the radical right seeks to solve through deportations, while the liberal or extreme center attempts to address it through a mixture of repression and integration into a utopian multicultural society of the future. Publicly funded cultural industries, including the literary one, are of course part of this integration project. In recent years, we can speak of a certain shift within the global literary field. If literatures from the periphery once had to secure the approval of the gatekeepers at the center to aspire to the Western canon and its readership markets, today the center itself is, to some extent, questioning its own canon and striving for a plurality of identities. This is likely both a result of integration efforts and a consequence of intensifying class struggles and attempts to obscure racial inequality within an ostensibly multicultural coexistence and a false empowerment. I'm not sure if all the sentences were translated correctly, but different syntax. What we often overlook is that the inclusion of so-called minority voices in the literature industry does not fundamentally change the conditions of proletarian and lumpen proletarian masses. Multiculturalism is created outside the sphere of production, within cultural circles and among multicultural upper and middle classes. Occasionally someone from the lower immigrant strata manages to break through, but representatives of the periphery are often authors who themselves come from peripheral, sometimes comprader bourgeoisies. Bourgeoisies that serve the bourgeoisies of the center at the expense of their own citizens. If the project of multiculturalism was once driven by external pressure, it is now becoming a norm imposed by the center. In the literature of small languages such as Slovene, and among readers who speak these languages, an interesting phenomenon can be observed. While academics fight to preserve the language from the influx of American English via Netflix, for example, I often hear young people speaking this form of English in public conversations, and only when they later add a few sentences in Slovene do I realize they are not tourists. And while they fight for young people's reading habits, since it is assumed that they no longer read, these same young people increasingly shift directly from reading Slovenian literature to reading literature translated into English or written originally in English. They read genre fiction, mostly fantasy, written to industrial standards, as well as artistic, identity-based, multicultural girl boss and other such literature, also written to industrial standards. Local authors attempt to transfer these standards into the Slovene language, but due to poorer working conditions, a smaller talent pool, and a certain inorganic quality and provincialism, they cannot offer products of equal quality by industrial standards. Even if these books receive awards and recognition from mainstream critics and academics, whose influence in the public sphere is steadily declining, literary criticism is disappearing from traditional media such as major newspapers, national radio, television, and online outlets. Regardless of efforts by locally subsidized culture to keep pace with the international literature industry, complaints about the unreadability of work in Slovene and the waning influence of criticism continue to grow. For deeper and more critical readers or lovers of literature, reading such works, essentially non-industrial copies of industrially polished literature, feels increasingly pointless. As a critic and an author who belongs to a minority community, I myself struggle with a personal aversion to contemporary industrial variants of so-called minority or immigrant literature and their local imitations. These works reduce the entire subjective and social experience to a simplistic, one-dimensional identity marker, usually shaped by the perspective of the middle and upper classes. As a critic and reader, I have in recent years encountered a phenomenon in which I fail to find real value in the most celebrated international works, despite their formal sophistication. Despite the supposed multiplicity of identities and experiences they contain, I see in most of them the narrow perspective of an international, one-dimensional representative of the middle class. A Nietzschean last man, a person at the end of the history who no longer interrogates their own subjectivity and critiques only within categories and concepts already given. Increasingly, this strikes me as literature of inertia. By contrast, I find growing meaning in literature that struggles to enter both the international circuit and the circuit of the most industrialized and unworded domestic literature. In literature not overdetermined by the ruling ideology of the center. In novels and poetry that possess a certain singularity, a specific subjective posture, and the courage for an authentic distance from literary form. A distance stemming from the inability to write a so-called masterpiece due to the material conditions of local literary production, or from simple indifference towards the idea of the masterpiece. This is not to say that such works are directly opposed to the content or ideas of internationally recognized literature, or that they reject cultural mixing or retreat into ideological conservatism or narrow localism. Rather, they are an organic expression of the extremely complex and contradictory contemporary world, one that encompasses both cosmopolitanism and local identities. These works are often more conflictual, searching and therefore formally unconventional or even unfinished. But this unfinishedness, is not necessarily a flaw. It can be a productive source of interpretation. In small languages such as Slovene, alongside authors who are immigrants or of immigrant background, but who belong to neither the canon or their new nor their original homelands, and instead form their own subcultures, we also find authors who belong to the majority ethnic group, but are minority in relation to the trends of globalized culture. Sometimes these are works by friends, acquaintances, or people from the same social milieu, which can be treated with the same critical seriousness as works by complete strangers or international authors. Their interest does not stem from the fact that within small scenes we might know their authors personally, but from the fact that they emerge from a shared habitus from which they can reveal something new to us. It is precisely the recognizable subjectivity, the specificity of viewpoint combined with authors' closeness to us that can produce the kind of otherness that I sought in international authors. The largely superficial otherness offered by contemporary global literary system, managed from the center even when speaking in the name of periphery, enables a re-evaluation of otherness on the micro level. It raises important questions about how different we truly are within our own social circles, social classes, ethnic or national groups. In doing so, it indirectly reveals the actual effects of today's globalized society at the micro level within the familiar, thereby estranging the exaggerated otherness of voices from the periphery. In this way, through our own otherness, we can truly perceive the kinship of the periphery and open new possibilities for universalism beyond the identity and identity politics already offered. Works in small languages such as Slovene make the most sense when they can offer something different from the globalized literary industry, to which even local subsidized culture tends to submit, as I already said. Instead of clinging to the illusion of our own importance or striving for personal fame that can be achieved only by repeating established patterns, it makes more sense to use subsidize for the literary field, its authors and critics, to create political micro-effects within civil society. This is where the potential for freedom lies, the possibility of immediacy which the industry and emerging canon can no longer offer. For this, one needs not to be an immigrant. One simply needs to take pleasure in one's small language. Thank you.
which we'll surely invite for a further discussion today and tomorrow. Today I will use the opportunity to ask you some questions which connect connect all three of your presentations, but also to ask each one of you something that I find specific in your views. So the focus on literary margins, this colloquium is inspired, among other things, by analysis of the global literary field that already here mentioned French theorist Pascal Casanova authored in her famous book, The World Republic of Letters. As all who read Casanova know, she describes the global literary field as an uneven and competitive field, but she also argues for the subversive potential of the cultural margins, and that is the inspiration for the first question I wish to ask you. To quote Casanova, she writes in World Republic of Letters, "Authors living today on the edges of the literary world, who long ago learned to confront the laws and forces that sustain the unequal structure of this world, and who are keenly aware that they must be recognized in their respective centers in order to have any chance of surviving as writers, should be the most sensitive to the newest aesthetic inventions of international literature. This lucidity and the impulse to rebel against the existing literary order are at the very heart of their identity as writers." So we can see that Casanova, although fully aware of relations of inequality, nevertheless assigns a certain advantage to the periphery, arguing that writers from the periphery see more clearly the laws that govern the literary field than those at the center. So my question is, what do you think of this claim? What problems does it raise? What does it mean to survive as a writer in today's world? Can the direction of aesthetic invention be reversed, not flowing from the center outward, but from the periphery inward? And what are the limits of resistance and of conformity in a world where one seeks for a recognition of the literary value of her or his work? So the question is multi-layered, but you can choose on which part to answer from your perspective. And again, in whichever order you choose to. Yes, so so in the widest sense, this subversive value of the periphery, of the margin, do you think that it is a sustainable opinion, or is somehow hiding some smaller problems or more complex situation?
I think, as I explained in my own way, it is still valuable to be from the periphery, but in another way. My colleague on the left explained that today the governments are trying to include the ones who have been already excluded. That exclusion is a way of inclusion. It goes maybe in the field of culture, which is formed by, as I said, upper middle classes, in another direction. Like the inclusion is a form of exclusion. So yeah, I think being in the periphery or semi-periphery nowadays is being concerned about your like micro level of your like social circle or your ecosystem, to say. To survive, what does it mean? In Slovenia we have this quite heavily subsidized culture, and people can get paid for books decently, even they cannot live from these payments, but if you work certain other jobs in the field of culture, you can survive materially in a way. So the selling, the number of copies sold of your book is not a priority for your material survival. this offers a unique possibility to do something different, to create your own, let's say, micro, small, or niche fan base, which truly relates to your work or interprets it in unique ways, and so on. This, for me, is, in a way, a position of an author from periphery or semi-periphery. Maybe in linguistic terms, Slovenia, a country like Slovenia, is peripheral because it's such a small language.
This was a lot of questions and huge questions, but I think the question, what does it mean to survive as a writer, is really interesting, because it puts in what does it mean to be a writer, and it connects to some of the things you said, but also to your presentation. What does it mean to survive, and what does it mean to be a writer? And I need to confess that I haven't read Casanova, so I don't know how deep she goes into certain problematics. But what I come to think about in regard to that question is the whole image of the writer and the commodification of the image of the writer. And here I'm only familiar with how the publishing business looks in Sweden. I found it quite like symptomatic and sad and annoying and in a way comic, that when I was looking for a publisher for my last book, which was a children's book, and I haven't written for children before, so I was kind of trying to find a publisher for a new genre. I just had started searching, and then I would be drowned by the algorithms, of course, by different publishing houses working as hybrid publishing houses, which is basically making the writer your client. What they sell is the publishing process to the writer, and the writer, which are often people who have this dream of becoming writers. And when you are a writer and know how the conditions are and how little money you get from it, it seems absurd that people have such high dreams of becoming writers, but these are capitalized on so much. People are paying so much to get their stories out with an image of getting money out of it. And how do we defend literature in a capitalist system that had commodified literature to that extent? I tend to be more and more inspired, and I think this also connects to your presentation. I tend to be more and more inspired by like subcultures producing fan fiction, which is of course of a very varying quality, but there are in like youth subcultures. There are these groups, these communities of people who write because of the joy of writing. And they don't want to have anything in terms of money or profit out of it. They just feel the joy of writing. And I find that marvelous. And that is very much a margin, I think. Also in terms of age.
And following your points, what does it mean to be a writer and how to protect the literature and what the literature is? Because everybody now is a writer all the time. We are not readers anymore. We are writing all the time. We are texting, but they are not artistic texts. They are just communication or informations. So how to protect the quality of writing? Who felt in love with style, with artistic work, and not with the words are never empty, but we are using them for communications and the other things. So it is difficult in Albania to protect, not only in Albania, but especially there, because the language is completely isolated. It is not part of a group of languages, like New Latin or Slavic languages. And if it was enough for our language, the punishment was another moment. We hoped a lot after the independence of Kosovo that the market will be doubled, because it is the same language, the same culture, let's say, but in fact not. The number of copies are the same, 500 copies. We have published a bestseller before the independence of Kosovo, and we are publishing the same number of copies. It is really a challenge to live as a writer, and I can confess that after Kadare nobody can live as a writer. We have to work, connecting to writing. Somebody is professor, somebody else is working as a journalist or a translator too. But it is an empty space for someone to call him a writer, especially politicians. I'm not kidding. If you will watch them on the screen, the typing right down the face of them is, for example, Ariane Leka, a writer, politician, a diplomat, and time after time a photographer. Because we have to understand that as a writer, nobody can believe that how difficult it is to resist and to survive.
Thank you. You partly answered my second question. It was about the literary market. So I will just recall one quote from Dubravka Ugrešić. Thank you for not reading, since all three of you problematize these processes of literary market and the tension between literary works that don't fit into neither traditional scholarly categories nor market literature. But I will just quote shortly because it is brilliant and very witty of her. Thank you for not reading. She writes, "Today's market literature is realistic, optimistic, cheerful, sexy, explicitly or implicitly didactic, and aimed at broad reading masses. As such, it ideologically transforms and educates masses in the spirit of the personal victory of some good over some evil. As such, it is socialist realist." So it is a really interesting way how she connects socialist realist poetics with today's market demands. But since you already touched on these problems of market and to keep in time, I would like to ask each one of you a question which somehow first came to my mind after reading your presentations. For Ariane Leka, I have a question about these complex issues in the relationship between cultural centers and peripheries, which you emphasized in your presentation. And I noticed that you see a part, not the whole solution, but only a part of the solution in strong critical voices as mediators between literary works and their reception at local and global levels. But my question is, what kind of infrastructure is needed to develop such voices? Because it seems that the dynamics of center and periphery also manifests itself in the level of structural support available to critics. And there is a paradox that critics are the ones who bridge the gap between periphery and center, yet their capacity to work also depends on the context in which they live and write. You mentioned the critics and writers living abroad. So what can you say about this structure that underpins a strong critical voice, and do long-term strategies for education and support for critics even exist? And will literature, to use your words, continue to depend more on luck than on structure?
Thank you for your questions and answer too, because a lot of my part of my answers are there. I read not only the book of Uresic, wonderful book, thank you for not reading, but another book too, Karaoke Culture, which is a very strong book, strongly and deeply connected to our topic too. The question of the structure is that, especially for the critics' voices, for somebody who is writing reviews or the literary critics, it was not a chance or good luck to say that after the pandemic time, it is connected or not with the pandemic time, but I'm phrasing this moment of the life. Many of Albanian literary magazines are closed, and many public libraries also too, and some of very good initiative of the bookstores, the biggest and oldest one in Tirana, was closed. So it is an infrastructure, I think, and we have it not anymore like before. The other point is public politics on culture. Maybe you know, because in a way we are neighbors, our Minister of so-called culture is named Ministry of Youth, Education, Infrastructure and Culture. So, the culture, we have not a vice minister for the culture, it is just a department. And the images of the bureaucrats is to produce, so-called produce, culture for the tourism. So, what to do with this indifference? There are 2 points, I think. And another question, I don't like to call it problematic because it is a fluid topic. Time after time, maybe 2 weeks ago, we closed our National Book Fair, and the most important book or best-selling book of this book fair was a kind of provocation. The title of the book is "I'm a Muslim." And the author, it is not a question of an author or a publishing house, but how an author is using this topic just to provoke, not to produce literature, high-quality literature. And by media, he sold until now 12,000 copies, which is a Nobel Prize never sold. The last Nobel Prize sold only 600 copies. So, because the atheists bought the book, the Muslims also, but this is the role of literature, selling books? I think not.
And to maybe connect this topic of a critic and the literary field to the translation, of which Patricia was talking about, I would like to relate a bit more on Casanova, because she, one of her theses is that the strength of a language is reflected in the number of literary polyglots who use it, because that number increases the chances for visibility, recognition, translation, and broader reception. So, from your experience, I wanted to ask you what challenges does the translator face as mediator between languages when dealing with literature that is by intention situated within a transnational literary space? Is this still a relationship between an original and the translation, or does a translation become the primary medium of such literature? And you said that you have the feeling of untranslatability of the work you are translating, so maybe if you could touch upon that problematics of translation and peripheries and minorities in the literary field.
Well, translation is also a huge issue, and I'm not sure if I can answer that, but I think there is something with. I think there is something with translation. There is something we can discuss around translation that also connects to Arian's last point there on what is the role of literature and this book that seems kind of a clickbait book that you mentioned. Translation, literary translation, is something, a miracle of sorts. I can get kind of spiritual when I think about translation, because that is, in a sense, translation always struggles with impossibility, but that impossibility is an existential possibility. That's the impossibility of understanding another human being. And we still do it. We do the impossible again and again and again. And we insist on doing it. And I think the interesting thing for me as a translator of Hans Aldue, and dealing with its linguistically hybrid text, is that it's a text that kind of, it really highlights what translation is by being manifestly partly untranslatable. It's a text that defies any expectation from the reader of being transparent, and that is part of why I have such a loving relationship and passionate relationship to this text. I've translated other texts that I don't have that kind of relationship to, but I think the challenges today are much more severe than perhaps they ever have been, because one thing is the question of small languages and the combination of commodification of literature and small languages struggling to even kind of survive as literary languages. On the other hand, we have this whole development that has escalated during last year with artificial intelligence, and what that does to the very idea of translation. If there was a common, a fairly common idea, notion of translation as a process transforming one text into an equal text, into the same, just of a different color. With artificial intelligence, the economic interest in this reductive idea of translation becomes so strong. So I think we have, in general, now I talk in a very broad and vague but I think it's a problem that, in general, the process of translation as a literary process has been given much too little attention. And I don't have any solutions and answers because I think it's very big economic interest that we are kind of struggling against. But I do think we need to lift that topic.
Thank you. And maybe to connect to that with my last question, I really want to to pose it. I hope we have time. You
need to pose it. I must not be left out.
Of course. You speak of the pleasure of the small language. This was a very interesting thought for me, and I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the pleasure of otherness in creation and reception, one not yet assimilated into dominant cultural policies or market imperatives, or, in your words, to the industrial standard in literature. And I also recalled that Ugrasic critically writes about commodification of pleasure and calls certain writers pleasure activists. So what kind of pleasure do you have in mind? Does it have a future, a community? Can it even be displaced from the margin without losing its critical potential? And visibility is usually something that is promoted as another kind of imperative, but does a certain kind of invisibility also have a critical potential of its own?
Well, the notion of pleasure is a pretty complex one, you know. But I was not thinking about the hedonistic, pornographic type of one-dimensional type of pleasure, more as a sort of masochistic pleasure of struggling with meaning, of struggling to find and produce and translate meaning into literature. This sort of pleasure. I didn't quite catch the last part of your question. Can you please repeat?
Can this kind of pleasure of small language, of which you are talking about, be displaced from the margins without losing its critical potential, or the part of the potential lies in the margin?
It's a very profound question. I don't think so. I think critical potential nowadays lies in such margin space, because mainstream space is so devoid of meaning that people are looking for something to happen, for some event, and event can only be it can only happen in marginal places, since they are so small and intense that they produce a sort of tension, sort of invention, not only in literature but also in political space. We see that mainstream political space is also pretty devoid of meaning and devoid of any ideas. Even if parties have different names or are placed on different sides of political spectrum, there is a notion of sort of extreme status quo center ruling, and people are thirsty for something new. But unfortunately, right now the right-wingers and neo-fascists are more inventing. They have the easier way of inventing the event, but not in literature. We need to find a way to connect literature, the field we are like normal people who are not fascists, better in to connect this field, this creativity with the physical spaces that we inhabit, to bring our creativity and ability to produce events into the public sphere on a larger level. And literature will not be enough for this, but it can be a good company in the process.
Thank you. I would also like to, I understood that the participants of the colloquium will have the opportunity to discuss many more questions tomorrow. I also didn't manage to read all of what I prepared, but I would like to give the opportunity for those who came in the audience to maybe have a short question. Now, if someone wishes to join the discussion. Okay.
I'll just start speaking.
I didn't see you.
No problem. Yeah, I'm behind the wall. Hi, my name is Matija. I'll help myself with the notes I made. I would like to pose the question for all of you, of course. All of you, more or less, in part at least, touched on this pros and cons of state finance, and also, as well as let's say, call it the free market or market state. Well, my question is, those pros and cons are more or less well known, although they depend and vary. Depending on whether we speak on central or the periphery. But what I want to ask is, do you know, or are you aware, or have you maybe thought of some alternative ways of artistic organization or general organization within the literary field that would transpose or at least try to diminish the negative effects of both market and state financing, and do you think it's more likely to be found at periphery or within the center? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I know a group of poets, mainly in Slovenia, the circle around Dejan Koban, who is a poet himself, but also an organizer of literature scene or poetry scene in Ljubljana. They are self-managing, they're not subsidized, and they also manage to pay some to the authors. And in the course of few years, they actually became the top quality, maybe the best Slovenian publishing house that produces original Slovenian poetry. So, yeah, this is just one example I can tell about from my experiences. From my experience, I think there are fanatical readers of literature. They still exist. We just need to find the ways to incorporate their interests into the way we produce literature. But I am, for example, too lazy to do this mainly, or we have different interests or fields of non-conformity to do that. Mostly we are too lazy to do it. But this example I mentioned shows that it can be done in certain conditions.
I think it's a very good question and something that really needs to be done as well. I'm speaking from the Swedish perspective, and Sweden usually in this comparisons of the attitudes, population attitudes, Sweden scores really high when it comes to trust in the state. And this is very much true for the cultural sector, where Sweden has had a very strong cultural politics, but has kind of, culture had become more and more like the unwanted stepchild of politics until the current government we have, which is a quite radical right-wing government, very much invested in the cultural law, and that has become a wake-up call, because I think precisely because of these very high level of trust, people are, and very much within the cultural sector, people are very unused to think about how do we survive and how do we support ourselves when the state is not kind of lifting us up. But I do know that there are discussions, concrete discussions on finding alternative forms within the community of journals of culture, where Sweden have, for such a small country, have a very strong scene of journals, like cultural journals that publish poetry, literary essays, and so on, and that have suffered severe cutbacks during these last couple of years. So these discussions are going on and trying to find kind of community-based ways of keep working.
Thank you for your question. I'm talking from the perspective of Tirana and some other cities in Albania. There are not a lot, but there still exist some models, and they refused, as an act of resistance, to collaborate with the states. I'm talking the states because there are different funds, local funds and central from the government. Since years, not less than 5 to 6 years, they're refusing to collaborate with the state, and they are creating, together with the youngest generation of writers, especially writers, this alternative scene, not to fight against someone, but just to offer another alternative. And monthly in Tirana we have these monthly corners readings around the city, not in one point. This exchanging, using books, just to promote the readings, And some others reading alternatives in groups, not online promotions, but just to have some events for the public present, not or to find this comfortable that Ugrisic wrote about. From the comfortable houses, you have the privilege to follow a hard discussion, for example. Those are some examples from Tirana.
Thank you all for your attention. Thank you for our panelists. And please.